If the Prophet's morning dhikr is meant to protect the day, why do so many people recite it and still feel anxious, reactive, or scattered by noon? That question is not a critique of the dhikr itself. It's a hypothesis about how human cognition works. Two people can repeat the same formula, identical words, identical timing, yet one becomes calmer, more ethically grounded, and more psychologically stable, while the other remains dysregulated and easily provoked. So what's missing? A plausible answer is that what's forgotten is not the wording, but the mode of attention and the deeper logic of what remembrance is doing to the mind. In other words, morning dhikr may function less like a talisman and more like an inner attention technology, a structured way to shape perception, emotion, and behavior at the start of the day. In this lecture, I'll use Ibn Arabi's philosophical framework to reinterpret morning remembrance in precisely those terms, not as aesthetic mysticism, but as a disciplined method for orienting consciousness, one that also has striking parallels with modern psychology and cognitive science. Let's start with the modern problem in clinical, psychological language. Many people wake up with high baseline stress, meaning the nervous system is already close to sympathetic activation. That state makes threat detection feel urgent, even when no immediate danger is present. Add a well-documented cognitive tendency called negativity bias, and the mind naturally scans for problems before it scans for meaning, value, or gratitude. Then, add the modern environment, notifications, news alerts, and constant information flow. This produces attentional fragmentation, which reduces working memory capacity and weakens self-regulation. In practical terms, the more your attention is splintered, the harder it becomes to inhibit impulsive reactions, and the easier it becomes to spiral into worry. Here's the key link. Much of your suffering is not only caused by events, but by how the mind configures reality in the first 60 to 90 minutes after waking. In psychological terms, your morning establishes a cognitive priming pattern. It biases what you notice, how you interpret ambiguous information, and how quickly you tip into emotional reactivity. A simple habit loop model explains why mornings deteriorate so quickly. The cue is waking up. The routine becomes scrolling, checking messages, or rehearsing worries. The short-term reward is a feeling of certainty. I know what's happening, but the long-term cost is heightened anxiety and increased interpretive hostility. So the problem statement is this: modern mornings often train the mind into reactivity, not presence. And the title's claim is that there is a forgotten dimension in prophetic morning remembrance that can function like a perception reset. If it's understood correctly, this is where Ibn Arabi becomes surprisingly practical. He's often introduced as a mystical poet, but that's an incomplete picture. Ibn Arabi is also a rigorous philosopher of consciousness, perception, and meaning. His project is to analyze how human awareness participates in reality through three linked processes: intention, Niyyah; attention or inner orientation, tawajjuh; and recognition or knowing, Ma'rifah. For Ibn Arabi, dhikr is not merely verbal repetition. It is a reorientation of the knower toward the urd. Reorientation changes what you notice, how you interpret, and how you respond. In a modern metaphor, it updates your day's operating system, not by changing external events, but by changing the cognitive architecture through which you meet those events. One important clarification. We are not making medical claims. We're mapping philosophical concepts onto modern cognitive science where parallels are plausible. Think of this as a disciplined translation. Ibn Arabi provides the conceptual language. Psychology provides models for how attention and emotion are trained. Dhikr as attention, calibration, not verbal output in Ibn Arabi's framing. Remembrance is an act of directed consciousness. The heart, or, if you prefer a modern term, the mind faces a meaning. Dhikr is not primarily sound, it is orientation. If remembrance is distracted, it becomes symbolic speech without cognitive transformation. The mouth moves. The mind keeps running its usual scripts, so the key variable is the quality of attention, diffuse. Attention produces a predictable result. Words run, mind wanders. Emotional tone stays the same. Sustained attention produces a different result. Meaning stabilizes, and the emotional field begins to shift. This aligns with what modern psychology calls attentional control and meta-awareness. Meta-awareness is the ability to notice that your mind has drifted, without collapsing into self-criticism, and to return to the anchor. That's why Dhikr, when practiced properly, resembles mindfulness-based attention training, not because it empties the mind, but because it regulates attention bias. A simple example makes this concrete. Two people say, Hasbiyah, God is sufficient for me. Person A says it while mentally rehearsing catastrophes, upcoming conflict, future loss, imagined humiliation. The phrase is present, but threat processing is still running. Person B uses the same phrase as an attention anchor. Each repetition is paired with a deliberate return from rumination to meaning. The verbal content is identical. The cognitive procedure is not. The forgotten element, then, is treating morning Dhikr as the day's attentional set, point training the mind's default orientation before the world starts pulling it in 1,000 directions. Tilk and perception. Why the day feels different. Ibn Arabi uses the concept of tilk, often translated as divine self-disclosure or manifestation. In practical terms, it means that reality is encountered through appearances, and your internal state affects what becomes salient. This is not the simplistic idea that you create facts. Rather, you encounter meaning through a lens. The world contains countless signals, neutral expressions, ambiguous emails, uncertain outcomes. The mind selects, emphasizes, and interprets. Dhikr, in this model, is a deliberate shift in the lens from egocentric urgency to God-centric intelligibility. The egocentric lens asks, what threatens me? What proves me? What humiliates me? The God-centric lens asks, what is required of me ethically? What does wisdom demand? What is the appropriate response? Notice how this parallels modern predictive processing models in cognitive science. The brain does not passively receive reality. It actively predicts and interprets. Prior beliefs and internal states heavily influence how ambiguous stimuli are understood. In anxiety, there is often an interpretation bias. Ambiguous information is perceived as danger. Take a common scenario. You arrive at work after a morning of worry. You open a short email. Can we talk today? In an anxious state, your predictive model fills in the threat. I'm in trouble. You arrive after stable remembrance after attention has been trained, and your nervous system has settled down. You interpret the same email as information. There's a conversation to have. The external data is identical. The internal lens changes the lived experience. This is why Dhikr can function like a top-down reframe, reducing interpretive distortions. In Ibn Arabi's terms, it changes which manifestations dominate. Your awareness, the divine names as cognitive emotional regulators, their teaching. The divine names al-Azam are not merely labels in Ibn Arabi's thought. They are modes of understanding and ethical perception. To remember a name is to cultivate the corresponding quality in cognition and action. This becomes extremely practical if you treat the names as psychological and behavioral regulators. Remembering ARM can train compassionate appraisal rather than harsh judgment. In cognitive terms, it biases you toward interpretations that preserve human dignity. Remembering al-Akbar trains meaning-making. You seek wise context instead of impulsive conclusions. Remembering al-Wakil supports relinquishing excessive control, which improves emotional regulation by reducing futile rumination before a difficult meeting, for example. Bringing al-Algam forbearance into attention can directly shape behavior. Forbearance is not passive. It is an inhibition skill, the capacity to pause, to delay impulsive response, to choose language that doesn't escalate conflict. Psychology has a clear parallel here. Emotion reappraisal. Reappraisal means changing interpretation in order to change. Emotional response. Another parallel is self-distancing. From my ego is being attacked to this is a situation to navigate intelligently. So morning remembrance can be structured as selecting a name, as your day's lens, almost like setting a behavioral policy, not because the name is a slogan, but because it organizes perception and response. Niyyah as the hidden engine. Now we reach what may be the most forgotten dimension. Niyyah, intention in Ibn Arabi's logic. The inward intention determines the spiritual cognitive reality of an act. The same Dhikr phrase, with different Niyyah, produces different effects because intention is not decoration, is the engine Niyyah. It's not vague positivity. It is a precise goal state for consciousness. It can be stated in clear cognitive terms. I remember to seek clarity. I remember to reduce reactivity. I remember to act with justice and patience. Consider two intentions. If your intention is, I want calm so nothing bothers me, you are trying to anesthetize reality. You resist life. If your intention is, I want steadiness so I can respond ethically, you remain engaged, but without being hijacked by emotion. This maps neatly onto two modern ideas. First, implementation intentions. The FX happens. I will do why method improve follow-through because they link a goal to a concrete behavioral response. Second, goal priming. Setting an explicit intention affects attention, allocation, and action selection. So the practical insight is simple. State your Niyyah explicitly before morning Dhikr, turning it into a cognitive protocol rather than an automatic recitation. At this point, we should address misconceptions. Dhikr is not magical immunity from hardship. Ibn Arabi's claim is more subtle. Remembrance aligns perception with the real. That alignment may actually increase clarity about trials, meaning you see problems more accurately, but it reduces egoic suffering, because your identity is less fused with the event. Now a paradox. Everything is from God does not eliminate responsibility. It can reduce blame cycles while preserving agency. In modern terms, it helps you avoid two extremes: total control and total helplessness. You act responsibly without being psychologically consumed by control. A related modern phrase that sometimes appears in this space is vibrational frequency. A rational reading is to treat it as metaphor. It refers to affective tone and nervous system state, not physics. A higher frequency corresponds to stability, pro-social orientation, and reduced reactivity. A lower frequency corresponds to threat mode, impulsivity, and narrowing of attention. The philosophical takeaway is this. For Ibn Arabi, the world you wake into is partly a function of what you recognize as real. If you recognize ego, narratives as ultimate status, fear, self-justification, your day becomes that. If you recognize divine meaning as primary wisdom, responsibility, your day reorganizes around those priorities. Let's convert this into a practical method, about 6 to 8 minutes, designed as a cognition training stack. Step 1, 30 seconds. Physiological settling. Sit still. Slow the breath slightly. The goal is not spirituality in the abstract. It is reducing arousal so attention can stabilize. From a neuroscientific perspective, lowering physiological agitation increases access to executive control. Step to 20 seconds. Explicit Niyyah. Formulate. 1 sentence. Today, I intend to. Make it ethical and psychological. For example, today, I intend to respond with forbearance and clarity. Step 3. 3 minutes. Dhikr as attention anchor. Recite your chosen morning dhikr, a concise formula with a single rule. Every time attention drifts, return without irritation. This trains meta-awareness and attentional control. You're practicing the skill of returning, which is the same skill needed when anger or anxiety tries to hijack you later. Step 4. 2 minutes. Divine name selection. Choose one. Name as the day's lens. Al-Akbar for wise decisions. Al-Algam for conflict. Al-Wakil for control issues. Then, translate it into a behavioral cue. When provoked, I will pause for 2 breaths before speaking. Stepway. Why seconds? Predictive processing reset. Ask, what story is my mind about to impose on today? Replace it with a more accurate model. I will meet events as information, not identity threats. Now, 2 scenarios. Scenario A. Social media or news stress. Delay inputs for 30 minutes after waking. You're protecting the attentional set point. If you flood the mind with threat signals early, you bias the entire day toward vigilance. Scenario B. Workplace conflict. Use name-based reappraisal plus the pause routine. The goal is not to be nice. It's to reduce escalation probability by keeping executive control online from a scientific standpoint. This protocol combines emotion, regulation, reappraisal, attention, training, anchor and return, and habit design curatin response. It is simple enough to test. Let's summarize the intellectual takeaway. Ibn Arabi reframes morning dhikr as a discipline of consciousness. Intention plus attention plus meaning. The forgotten element is not an extra phrase, it's a method. Dhikr becomes attentional calibration and ethical perception training. And the final insight can be stated plainly. Your day is not only what happens to you, it is also the quality of the consciousness that meets what happens. If morning remembrance is practiced as cognition training, it becomes repeatable and Tajallī. Try the 6 to 8 minute protocol for 7 mornings. Track 3 variables: reactivity, attention drift, and interpersonal outcomes. Compare the week to your baseline. That is the kind of experiment Ibn Arabi would appreciate, not as laboratory science, but as disciplined self-knowledge, a rational, spiritual practice grounded in how the mind actually works.